We are fortunate indeed to have with us again today Dr. Aaron David Miller, a preeminent expert and commentator on the Middle East, in particular on the seemingly intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A month ago, as we all know, that conflict exploded into a murderous Hamas sneak onslaught at dawn upon Israeli civilians and military, and it has now progressed into profoundly regrettable loss of Palestinian civilian life as Israel strikes back emphatically to rescue hostages and to attempt to extirpate Hamas. Dr. Miller worked in the Department of State for 24 years, serving 6 secretaries of state of both parties as an advisor on Arab-Israeli negotiations, involved in efforts to broker agreements between and among Israel, Jordan, Syria, and the Palestinians. A University of Michigan graduate with a bachelor's degree and then a master's degree in American Civil War history, Dr. Miller pivoted to the Middle East for his PhD degree, including learning both Hebrew and Arabic in Jerusalem 50 years ago. Entering the State Department about 45 years ago, in its Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which we all know as INR, Dr. Miller soon became the department's top analyst for Lebanon and the Palestinians. He eventually joined the policy planning staff, advising Secretaries of State George Shultz and James Baker, including assisting the latter in planning the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Miller was appointed Deputy Special Middle East Coordinator. For 7 years throughout the Clinton administration, he helped structure the U.S. role in Arab-Israeli negotiations through the Oslo process, multilateral Arab-Israeli summits, the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, final status negotiations between Israel and Syria, as well as in the year 2000 Camp David Accords between Israel and the Palestinians. Following service to Secretary of State Colin Powell as senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, Dr. Miller departed state. Thereafter, Dr. Miller was a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he now is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. In his spare time, Dr. Miller is a frequent commentator on a wide spectrum of broadcast media, including CNN, PBS, the BBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Al Jazeera, and to balance that lineup, Fox News. With that, by way of introduction, Dr. Miller, welcome, and the podium is yours.
Tim, thank you so much. And also a shout out to Ambassador Philip Hughes for playing a part in getting me here. Tim used the word doctor way too many times. I do have a PhD in Middle Eastern and American diplomatic history, but I do not use that title, and I willfully and intentionally ensure that when I'm introduced places that it is not used. Tim went ahead even after I told him the story and basically used it. It was in 1977. I just got my PhD from the University of Michigan, invited to a conference in Los Angeles. I think you can tell where this story is going. Back before then, there was no TSA, so I puffed up, bought my ticket as Dr. Aaron David Miller. I was in coach, sitting on the aisle, I'll never forget it. An hour into the flight, they were called stewardesses back then, not flight attendants. Dr. Miller, could you come with me? All I heard was Dr. Miller. And then I said, why? Because there's a gentleman in first class and we think he's having a heart attack. So I decided then and there, and I'm quite serious about this. I don't know how many PhDs are issued in the United States today. When I graduated, I think there were 35,000. I do not begrudge other people from using the title of Dr. Jill Biden. Should be Dr. Jill Biden, that's important to her. I decided long ago when in the middle of my transition from Civil War history to Middle East history, I encountered 2 gentlemen, Richard Mitchell, who was a foremost expert on the Muslim Brotherhood, and Gerald Linderman, a historian of Americans at War. These men had been Foreign Service officers. In the case of Dick Mitchell, I think he worked across the river as well. They told stories and related experiences that were just extraordinary to me. And I decided then and there, if I wanted to teach Middle Eastern history, I needed to have some of those. One thing led to another, and I ended up at the Department of State. It's impossible in 25 minutes to even begin to put your arms around what we've witnessed during the course of the last month. I want to make 3 or 4 observations and then focus this conversation on U.S. rule. I think it's an organizing principle that may allow us to explore a lot of different dimensions because it's really complicated. Number 1 is humility. I've witnessed, participated in any number of terrible conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians, 2 intifadas, at least 4 Israeli-Lebanese confrontations beginning in the late 80s that involve Palestinians, and the daily grind and the perverse dance that the occupier does with the occupied. The power of the strong meets the power of the weak, which is a formidable power not to be underestimated, and the dysfunction that is produced sustains this conflict. But I've never seen a crisis, in my experience, about which we know so little. We know nothing about the state and fate of 241 humans now in possession of Hamas, maybe Palestine Islamic Jihad, and there are reports that individual Palestinians and families also hold hostages. Nothing. We know nothing about, when I say we, I'm part of the initiated, uninitiated member of the general public. We know nothing about the negotiations brokered by the Qataris or the Egyptians, thanks, with the participation of the United States and Israel. My friend of 40 years, Bill Burns, is now in Qatar, I understand, and I'm sure he's in touch with Ronen Bar, who's the head of Mossad and the head of the Shin Bet. We know very little. It's so opaque. We know almost nothing about the Israeli ground campaign. Israelis, understandably, have dominated the information space. They control the narrative. There are reporters who have been embedded for a very bird's eye view of what's happening there. And we know very little about, we think we know more about the prospect of escalation along the Israeli-Lebanese border. I think actually of all the things we don't know, that actually may be relatively certain in terms of Hezbollah and Iran's calculations and their risk aversion, at least 4 months into this. So I am very careful and circumspect in my analysis. It really requires a lot of discipline not to speculate. Number 2 is humanity. What occurred on October 7th, the largest terror attack in the history of the state of Israel, more Jews were killed in that 24-hour period than in any single day since the Nazi Holocaust. It's the largest intelligence failure. It elevated, and again, I'm not here to talk about what about it. It's possible to look at 2 discrete events, what happened on October 7th in the brutal Israeli blockade and air campaign in an effort to eradicate Hamas's military capacity. You can hold these 2 thoughts in your head without, and I'll quote Tony Blinken here, without creating some sort of hierarchy when it comes to civilian deaths in war. An Israeli life is no more or less valuable than a Palestinian life. On October 7th, and I mention this only because it reflects the frame of what is happening in Israel, and it has had a huge impact on American policy over the last month. The degree of savagery and brutality, the intimacy of the killing. It wasn't just the fear, it's the fear married to the helplessness. The fact that from anywhere from 3 to 12 hours, these people, the thousands who lived in 20 border communities proximate to Gaza, were completely exposed and on their own. It is the violation of the basic contract between the governed and those who govern. The legitimacy of a government rests in its capacity to protect its people. That contract was violated in as horrid a way as possible. And October 7th lives on through the 241 hostages, babies, men, women, children, dual nationals, at least 25 countries, mostly Israeli citizens. And that has created a frame, but it cannot harden us, and it cannot have us closing our hearts and minds to the incredible suffering of what's happening to the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza today. 21,000 humans per square mile. Half the population is going to be displaced already, maybe 700,000 to 800,000. And obviously, whether you choose to believe Hamas has controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health or not, the death range is in the thousands. President took issue with that publicly, probably wasn't the best thing to say publicly. So Hamas may be inflating their statistics, but frankly, based on the images and the pics, I'm not sure it really matters all that much. It's a range of destruction and devastation visited upon Gaza by an Israeli Defense Force determined to eradicate Hamas as a military entity in an incredibly complex and difficult environment with military assets co-located in densely populated civilian areas. It's possible to hold these two thoughts and consider each one separately without trying to judge the horror of one at the expense of the other. And third is hope and history. On October 6, 1973, I was in Jerusalem and I watched an entire nation traumatized by what was then the largest intelligence failure in history of the state of Israel. Within 6 years of that trauma, Egypt and Israel signed a full treaty of peace. So trauma turns to hope. 20 years later, I'm sitting on the White House lawn watching Arafat, Clinton, and Yitzhak Rabin sign the Oslo Accords, wrongly convinced in a horrible misjudgment and galactic analytical failure on my part, convinced that we had reached a sort of moment of irreversibility and Israeli-Palestinian peace was only a matter of time. And yet, we're now in trauma. So these two experiences, trauma to hope and hope to trauma, have convinced me of one thing above all, and it sits up here as I watch all of this. We cannot see what's in front of us. The arc of history bends in ways that are strange and unpredictable. The only thing that matters is whether humans decide to work tirelessly and fearlessly to try to bend that arc in as positive and as right-thinking a direction as possible. Every breakthrough in the Arab-Israeli arena, and I choose my words carefully here, in the core conflict area, the Abraham Accords are a special set of arrangements. They are not governed by the laws of political gravity, historical wounding, trauma, and conflict that governed Israel's relations with Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and a putative Palestinian national movement seeking to become a state. Every one of the breakthroughs, 73, and there haven't been many, 73, Madrid Peace Conference in 91, which was preceded by Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and the first Bush administration's efforts to push Saddam out, and the Oslo process, which was driven by the first Intifada. All were prefaced by war, terror, and insurgency. There are no straight lines here. You're going to be left at the end of this crisis with two traumatized societies. There will be a political reckoning in each society of a different kind. The average length of an Israeli government since independence is 1.8 years. Either reconstituted government in place or new elections. The Netanyahu government is bumping up against its 1-year mark in December. There will be a state commission of inquiry, as there was in 73. In 73, headed by Supreme Court Justice, it filed its interim report in April of 74. It identified the military and intelligence and security elites as responsible for the conception, the failure of the Israelis to imagine that Saddam would strike without weapon systems that could neutralize Israeli aircraft and tanks, but he did anyway. But they left Golda Meir untouched. She resigned soon after under public pressure. There will be a reckoning, but note, it took another 3 years for the true political earthquake in Israel to make itself known. And that was elections in the spring of 1977, which brought to power Menachem Begin, Likud party. And with some exceptions, Likud has dominated Israeli politics for decades. So this is not going to be an easy transition. On the Palestinian side, if Hamas survives, and the idea of a Islamist insurgency, residual elements of Hamas emerging, even while the Israelis are in some way, shape, or form present in Gaza, let alone if there's a transitional mechanism that isn't legitimate, Hamas will resurge. The Israelis can destroy their military capacity. The Israelis can destroy their administrative capacity. They can literally extinguish Hamas's sovereignty in Gaza. What they cannot do, and which ultimately is the great challenge here, is to destroy Hamas as an idea. It is an ideology. It's deeply rooted in the social, economic, and religious fabric of Gaza. People ask me, why did Hamas do this? Didn't they understand the consequences of their action? The truth is, yes, they did. Because the objective is not to seize territory. The objective is not to set the stage for negotiation. The objective is to restore the Palestinian issue as the central feature of Middle Eastern politics and to drive Hamas's role as the central deliverer of this question. Regardless of when Palestinians get a state, if the Israelis tomorrow said to Hamas, two-state solution, sure, and Mahmoud Abbas became the president, it would not be sufficient. Hamas wants an Islamic state. You can't separate the ideological component and the roots that it has struck in Gazan society. What the numbers are, impossible to know. But the day after problem for Palestinians is going to be even more challenging because the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, now in an 18th year or 4-year term, feckless, corrupt, nepotistic, no credibility on the Palestinian street, zero. Canceled elections in 2021 is going to be at the center, even judging by the administration's public comments, at the center of an effort to revitalize the Palestinian Authority and somehow create a governing mechanism, which will require new elections, both for a Palestinian legislature and a new presidency. I think we have to strike from our minds the notion of a day after. It is not going to be a day after. It's going to be weeks. It'll be months. It'll be years. There's no bright line between the end of Israeli military operations and what follows. And the biggest challenge that Israel will face is what follows. And it brings me to an additional point. This is not Israel's 9/11. It is a wholly false and, in my judgment, not dangerous, but it's misleading. We didn't have a proximity problem with Al Qaeda. We didn't. On 9/11, we did. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is driven by proximity. That's what separates it from Israel-Egypt, Israel-Syria, Israel-Jordan, Israel-Lebanon, and certainly Israel and the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Bahrainis, and the Moroccans. That proximity problem guarantees there'll be no status quo in this conflict. But what it also has demonstrated now is the vulnerability and danger of proximity. People say all the time, Israelis and Palestinians really don't understand one another. They understand one another only too well. And this, I think, has been fiercely demonstrated on both sides by what happened on October 7th. Hamas has already achieved a significant goal. The Israelis have relocated 100,000 people, and in a country of almost 10 million, 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, 7.5 million Israeli Jews. They relocated people from the northern border and from the Gaza envelope communities. And the reason is not rockets. What Hamas has done is to inject in a country that had grown used to a manageable status quo, fear. The fear of a cross-border incursion either from Lebanon or from Gaza or in the West Bank, where you have 500,000 Israelis in settlements, that we could be slaughtered in our homes. That, when the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Herzog, said on October 6th, Israel was one country, and October 8th, it was another country, that's to be taken very seriously. It explains the determination and the rage with which the Israelis are pursuing their ground campaign. It also explains, and I'll transition to U.S. policy, and I'm just reporting here. Whatever your views are, whether it's good, bad, too little, too much, to my analysis. On October 10th, the president gave a speech. It was one of the most powerful speeches of his presidency, I think. The rhetoric, drawing images of the Holocaust. He talked about, quote, the black hole of loss, unquote, reflecting the tragedies and this profound loss in his own personal life. He looks at himself, and the presidential model here for Joe Biden is not Barack Obama, it's Bill Clinton. They're of a different generation, but they look at Israel, the idea of Israel, the security of Israel, as this sort of sacred trust. I saw Clinton up close and personal in the wake of Rabin's murder. I mean, he writes in his memoirs, I loved Rabin as I had loved no man. I mean, that's the president of the United States saying this. The bond, and Clinton had no experience with the reality of Israel throughout his political career. Joe Biden believes he is part of the Israeli story. It is no coincidence whether he was advised or not by Secret Service to go spend a day in Israel, historic wartime visit. No coincidence. That's who he is. His regard for Israel is deeply imprinted on his emotional and political DNA. That explains, and the horrors of October 7th explains the first several weeks of these pronouncements. And all you need to do, if you needed further evidence of his capacity to accommodate rather than confront, is to look at the 10 months of the Netanyahu government and the way this administration has dealt with it. It is, annoyed with Netanyahu, frustrated with Netanyahu, angry at Netanyahu. Everything is true. But an unwillingness to impose any costs and consequences, either with respect to the judicial reform, which you could argue is an internal Israeli matter, but more to the point, unwilling to do much about the policies of the Israeli government, which were annexationist in everything but name with respect to the West Bank. I think that the policy has evolved. The frame that the president created on October 10th is evolving. It's evolving because of the exponential rise in Palestinian deaths. It's evolving because of the humanitarian catastrophe. It's evolving because in discussions between the Secretary and Netanyahu, Austin and Gallant, the Minister of Defense, Bill Burns is there now. There is I think a profound sense not surprising, that the Israelis really don't have a clear understanding of how they connect their ground campaign and the destruction of Hamas as a military entity with the proverbial a day after. They sent a 3-star with experience in Mosul to counsel the Israeli government. They've offered suggestions. Change your ordinance. Don't drop 1,000, 2,000 pound bombs on refugee camps, even though Hamas may be co-located there. Use small diameter bombs. That's not a great look, by the way, for an administration. And I've been told that they are definitely not providing any targeting information or helping the Israelis manage their target sets with respect to the bombing. But I think there is a sense on the part of the administration that the Israelis are drifting. And they probably are drifting. And so this has created a situation where you have Israel's operational clock ticking very slowly. They're determined, if it takes weeks or months, to do what they need to do. Then you have the other clock, which is the president's political clock, which is ticking at a much faster rate. He's being hounded by progressive Democrats. There was a letter, I'm told, I don't know who signed it, 26 senators, that's no small matter, asking him to ask tough questions of the Israelis about their tactics and their military strategies. There's talk of the base eroding in a state like Michigan. And he's being pressed by the administration's Arab partners and friends in the region, and by just about everybody, maybe with the possible exception of a European or two, to do something. The real question is, the two clocks are not out of sync. There's no question about it. At what point does there come a point where they have to be synchronized and the president has to say or do something that goes well beyond what he's done so far with the Israelis? I heard him just before I came over in Andrews, I think. They asked him about, there was a supposed deal on the table, a 3-day humanitarian pause. Hamas was going to release 10 to 15 hostages, including some Israelis, women and children. And somebody asked him, it was windy, so I'm not sure if he could hear, I couldn't, whether he asked for a 3-day pause. And he said, I've asked for a much longer pause than that. Where the administration has not gone, and if they do go there, you'll know that there's been a fundamental change is to a ceasefire, because the difference between these humanitarian pauses, localized arrangements to facilitate humanitarian goods going in and maybe humans coming out, is one thing. The Israelis did it on October 20th when they paused their bombing to allow the two dual nationals, American and Israelis, to leave. A ceasefire is an indirectly negotiated arrangement that could stop conflict for a relatively short period of time or even longer. And that's precisely, and again, do I know what Hamas is thinking? I do not. Do I know what's in the mind of Mohammed Deif and Yahya Sinwar, who, by the way, was one of the Palestinians the Israelis traded in 2011 for Gilad Shalit, 1,079 Palestinians. Shalit was kidnapped in 2005 in Gaza. Took 6 years to get him out, and the Israelis gave up 1,079 prisoners. He was one of them. He knows precisely how vulnerable an Israeli government is on the issue of hostages. Apparently, the Israelis said no to the deal. So that's a question. I don't have an answer. I do, however, believe that Israel and the United States are really in a bind on this one. There are just too many questions that I think the Israelis don't have answers for, and frankly, I'm not entirely persuaded we do as well. Let me say one more thing about maybe the Israeli-Lebanese front. An escalation there would reframe this conflict entirely. We have 2 carrier strike groups in Eastern Med, a nuclear-powered submarine, 200 strike aircraft, a Marine Expeditionary Unit with 2,000 Marines and sailors who can do amphibious landing, embassies, extraction, special ops. The administration has been pretty successful, I think, in demonstrating to Hezbollah and Iran that there could be, maybe a cost if in fact they choose to escalate. For 3 weeks, Hezbollah and Israel have accepted the rules of the so-called game to avoid going back to the summer of '06. Let me remind you what happened during that summer. 5,000 guys, Hezbollah, with relatively inaccurate high trajectory weapons, shut down the northern half of the Middle East's most preeminent military power for 34 days. Now, 150,000 to 200,000 high trajectory weapons of varying ranges and lethality. Ground combat experience learned the hard way by supporting Assad in Syria. So far, Hezbollah has not chosen to escalate. My own sense is that he doesn't want to. Nasrallah does not want to, because Hamas is doing much of their work for them. And he has no intention of courting what could be a massive Israeli military strike with U.S. support to erode that asset that he has, which I think is being reserved and coordinated with Iran in the event that the United States or Israel would strike Iranian territory directly in an effort to destroy Iran's conventional or unconventional military sites. So far, so good. It reminds me of the guy who jumps out of the 10-story building and he's going past the 5th floor. Somebody says, "How you doing?" And he says, "So far, so good." I worry about that, but so far it's helped. I'd like to find, in closing, some sort of, good news about all of this. But I think we're now at a place that we've never been before in any Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the course of the last 50 years. It goes beyond 73 from the standpoint of Israel, and it goes beyond any set of airstrikes that the Israelis have ever conducted. Probably more airstrikes than any military has used in the 21st century. So I'm going to stop.
All right. So first hand up goes to Ambassador Siebert and then Governor Gilmore.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate your reporting on this. I have a question that's probably not answerable, but suppose that Israel follows military approach. I just like to get your take on the proposition that I've heard from those who want the hammer rather than the peace process going forward. And that is, I've heard the analogy that, we know that Hamas is an ideology. It's not a territory of people. But so was Al-Qaeda was, the ideology that Al-Qaeda had.
Or the Islamic State.
Yeah. But they have been largely, since our engagement there, have been suppressed in terms of their effectiveness of making attacks. Do you see any analogy between the two ideologies that would give anyone hope if that's the approach that
Well, I think there are. I think Hamas borrowed from the ISIS playbook in terms of their tactics on October 7th. I interviewed General Petraeus. I'll send you the link, because we talked a lot about Gaza and his experience in Fallujah and even in Mosul. It's the proximity problem. The Israelis, America could operate against the Islamic State in Raqqa, in Mosul, in Syria, and Iraq with great effectiveness. Maybe, the government of Iraq obviously had certain interests that aligned with the Americans and certain interests that aligned with Iran. But there was a freedom of action and an absence of integration of these militias into the terrorist groups, into the body politic. That is not the case here. there may be 10,000 Hamas bureaucrats that kept the Hamas governing structure operating. Some of those people are probably, you get a diversity of a range of alignments with these ideologies. It's a religious organization. And I think that is a critically important piece. And it is perceived to be a legitimate part of the Palestinian national movement. That's the difference. The Qataris have been hosting the external leadership for years, and with Israeli acquiescence, I might add, and this was part of the Concepcion problem, funneling money with Israeli acquiescence into Hamas's hands in order to stabilize Gaza. The Israelis were absolutely convinced that Yahya Sinwar wanted a little teeny state. They were just about to up the numbers of Palestinian workers, 17,000 to 20,000, coming from Gaza to work and send remittances back, hugely important to the Gazan economy. Hamas sent this strong signal that they were not interested in this messianic millennial. We're going to fundamentally break this open, which is exactly what they've done. But it's still a governing structure with roots in the community. And I don't know if it was Petraeus or maybe it was General Kimmett said, and this is military speak, right? I mean, you kill one terrorist and you produce three. I don't know what the impact of the Israeli air campaign and ground campaign is going to be on the Palestinian public, how they're going to process this. Will they blame Hamas? Have they ever blamed Hamas? A poll was done October 6th, shortly before this operation was launched. 790 respondents. Who would you vote for president of the Palestinian Authority? 32% said Marwan Barghouti, who's serving 5 lifetime sentences in an Israeli prison. Great legitimacy among the Palestinian public. 28% said Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas. And 12% said Mahmoud Abbas, the current president of the Palestinian Authority. So there's no doubt that I would argue the majority of Gazans are not devotees, but you don't need a majority. Not in a society where, in fact, elections mean very little, and you have an authoritarian structure providing not just, furthering your dignity as a Palestinian, but social services. So it's going to be critically important, to answer your question, it'll be critically important to see what kind of structure can emerge in Gaza that would address Palestinian security and prosperity. And how much of that is going to be effective to counter. Iran will want to feed a lot of money into Gaza in the wake of this. They'll have their Islamist groups, they'll have their individuals. That's the issue here. In the Fallujah, within 5 days, Fallujah is about a fifth the size of Gaza. Gaza is twice the size of the District of Columbia. In 5 days, Petraeus said, they ended all organized opposition. 75 American soldiers were lost, 600 wounded, 2,200 insurgents were killed. But in 5 days, it was all over. We're now on day 32. And from the reports, and they're all sporadic, Hamas is not directly engaging the Israelis in positions around Gaza City. They pop up here and there with RPGs and automatic weapons. But their main assets are in what the Israelis call the Gaza Metro, 300 miles of tunnels, half the size of the New York subway system. 300 miles of tunnels. The Israelis are talking about interrupting the ventilation systems. That's one of the reasons they don't want fuel delivery into Gaza. Water desal works on fuel. Hospital generators work on fuel. Delivery, how do you deliver assistance to people in need if you don't have fuel for your trucks? So this is really messy.
So as you put it, the essential difference between what ultimately was done with ISIS and what has been characterized as why doesn't Israel do to Hamas what we did to ISIS is the proximity issue. That's the great distinguishing factor between the two.
Right. Proximity, I asked a Palestinian in the 80s why, before we engaged with Arafat, why he supported Arafat. And the answer he gave me it was so right. He said, and I quote, "Arafat is a stone I throw at the Israelis every day." A stone I throw at the Israelis every day. I think that's one of the reasons there's been no Arab Spring in Palestine. They have the same problems: corruption, lack of transparency, bad governance, and yet no serious effort, either in Gaza or in the West Bank, to challenge the governing structures. The Palestinians are always going to look to the Israelis and their supporters as the number one problem, not their own leaders. So there's this intimate sort of organic connection. I don't want to make too much out of this because you change people's lives and you can separate them from their ideology. But we're a long way away from testing that proposition.
So next is Ambassador Gilmore, then Ambassador McDonald.
Tim, I wanted to ask a question, but I've got a radio show at 2 o'clock. And if you're still here, I'm gonna come back and ask my question, but I'll pass one.
All right.
Thanks, Mr. Ambassador. And Mr. Miller, with all your distinctions and great service, and thanks for doing this. And thanks to Tim and Philip for getting you here. I mentioned earlier I served in the second Clinton term in Zimbabwe. I wanted to just get a Hezbollah question in, if you don't mind. Hassan Nasrallah. I can, because it was in official open channels and publicly noted, Hezbollah operated in Zimbabwe when I was there. Petrol stations, lots of money-making ventures, sending money back to the Bekaa Valley. And this is 97 to 2001. The Israelis had a very nascent embassy in Harare. People need, maybe, since I'm an Africanist, among other things, others might not know that a number of the African countries with South-South and the non-aligned movement never recognized Israel till later. And so not until about 93, 94 did Mugabe, who was in charge when I was there, and I had 25 one-on-one meetings with him. But in any event, Israel had an ambassador. He was also covering some other neighboring countries. He had one Mossad person. So we did a lot with, magnetometers, and I had a pretty healthy CIA station, and we did a lot to help them. I would also add to the mix the dean of the diplomatic corps. He'll probably laugh. Holly May was the PLO representative to Zimbabwe, and I think he was there for years because they probably, I suppose they had enough going on to buy him plane tickets somewhere, but he was there for years. Assess for us, again, just as a sidecar to this whole situation, and hopefully it'll just continue to be this limited bombardment on the northern border. But Nasrallah, tell us about him and give us some background on very, very formidable, and I'm a lawyer. I've actually had some business in Lebanon, but tell us about Hezbollah a bit and Hassan Nasrallah.
Formed in the early 80s in the wake of Israel's invasion of Lebanon and directly implicated via the Syrians in the attack on the battalion landing team headquarters, the 240 Marines, and the attacks on the embassies. It plays a double role. It has authentic, legitimate roots in Lebanese politics. It represents a large Shia community, probably the largest confessional group in the country. It owes its creation, its resources, and its street cred to the assistance and funding it gets from Iran. It's allied with the Assad regime in a sort of, I call it a Shia crescent, but it's, you've got Iran, you've got the Assad regime, you've got Hezbollah. It's very careful in the wake of what happened in 2006. In fact, Nasrallah gave an interview, which was rather remarkable, after the war ended. Basically said, had he known that his operation launched to kidnap 2 Israeli soldiers would have led to this, he never would have authorized the operation. So the price that they paid, the Lebanese infrastructure, the Lebanese people paid for that 34 days was a prohibitive one. And I think Nasrallah understands that he's prepared to fight Israel, at least for now, to the last Palestinian. The real test will come if, in fact, Iran and Hezbollah believe that Hamas is on the verge of being extinguished. And even then, I think they would probably wait to see how adept the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Biden administration, the international community, key Arab states are in trying to fashion a structure in Gaza, which would be designed to counter the residual Islamist elements that will be operating there. Hard for me to believe that any Arab state would deploy their gendarme or military forces to do counterinsurgency against Palestinians. The Egyptians, as you know, governed Gaza from 48 to 67. They have security and economic reasons as to why they don't want to open up Rafah. But I think Nasrallah is acting, in Iran's, and even the Lebanese political class best interest by signaling they're prepared to keep the Israelis preoccupied along the Lebanese border, but not ready to risk a full-on confrontation. I mean, with 2 carrier strike groups, I think there'd be a serious possibility that the United States would get involved, even if Iran didn't, in supporting the Israelis. One other thing, and that is there is a back door to this escalation, which not enough people, I don't hear much talk about it, and that is pro-Iranian militia strikes against American bases in Iraq and Syria. If one of those attacks succeeds in killing large numbers of Americans, the U.S. will have no choice but to respond. And I don't think, the proportionate responses against pro-Iranian militias, even the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps ammunition facilities, may not be enough.
Right.
It's a hard one to sort of, because nobody wants a regional war. And when I say a regional war, I don't just mean a contained Israeli-Lebanese war.
Sure.
I'm talking about a regional war in which Iran would strike American assets in the Gulf. You'd have direct Israeli strikes against Iran and reciprocity from their part. You'd have the United States involved, and you'd see a spike in oil prices and probably a plunge in financial markets as well. The Russians and the Chinese probably look at this in sort of a mixed way, since the US Navy, basically CENTCOM, is protecting Saudi exports of oil to China. Putin might look at this. He doesn't want his Iranian patron or ally to be humiliated, but he sees the amazing thing to me is, it's a side point, but maybe sort of a reflection of the media. Part of it's the Ukrainian counteroffensive, but I'm stunned by the fact that the so-called fulcrum of Western civilization, our effort to support Ukraine in the face of brutal and naked aggression by Russia, has essentially disappeared.
Yeah.
Part of it's the Ukrainian, part of it's the difficulties, and the head of the Ukrainian military used the S word, as you know, last week,
Yes.
stalemate, and it may cost him his job.
Yeah.
So, and then you have the funding issue with Congress,
Sure.
twinning. So it's off the point, but I think we're still not, the longer this goes on, that's the problem with this problem. The greater the temptation and the risks of a miscalculation. Arab-Israeli wars usually don't start by accident. They're preceded by a long period of, and that's really what we have now.
Right. Okay, just one very quick follow-up,
Yeah.
Tim and David Miller. So just, I'm always fascinated, this thing with Mugabe and all these meetings and his history, Nasrallah. So he's obviously Lebanese. And how did he get to that position? Have we ever had to sit down with him or Hezbollah as an American? We have these back channels.
Well, yeah.
And so who is he?
Well,
How did he get to?
You know as well as I that there are all kinds of ways messages can be delivered.
Of course.
To people that are on our foreign terrorist organization, as that's probably is. Nasrallah emerged in the wake of the 80s, fought his way up the Shia hierarchy, challenging traditional Shia leaders like Nabi Berri for influence and control. And like Hamas, they ascribe to the dawah, the calling, although in Shia Islam, I think it's different, provision of social services, patronage to the majority population in Lebanon, which is Shia. They've aligned in the interest of politics makes strange bedfellows with certain Christian politicians as well, certain Christian politicians. And Nasrallah's been smart, and he's a survivor. And I suspect he, unlike Hamas, I don't think he's interested in rolling the dice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So when Michael DeSombre was ambassador in Thailand.
Thank you for that very interesting but also sort of depressing tour of history. In that regard, you emphasize obviously the challenges of the current strategy, and it may result in a situation which maybe ends up being worse because there's no solution to how to govern Gaza and rise of Islamic fundamentalism, making worse. If you had been in charge, what would you have done in response, and would that have been something that was politically acceptable to the Israelis, I guess, in light of the nature of the attack?
I mean, if I had my 5 minutes with President Biden.
No. If you could have determined what Netanyahu did.
President?
Right. No, not President of the U.S., President of Israel.
I mean, I describe most choices. Governing is about choosing. It's about setting priorities. FDR quipped, I haven't been able to find the quote that supposedly said that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything. This is our undeniably greatest president. 7 or 8 years, look what he accomplished. Governance is about choosing. Biden's choices in this.
I'm actually asking about Netanyahu's choices, not Biden's.
Oh, you want Netanyahu's choices?
What would you have done if you had been Netanyahu in responding to the October 7th incursion?
Well, that would have, if I were to be Netanyahu, no, I mean, it's serious. When I asked the question of the state, I am the state is me. I think that informs the way Benjamin Netanyahu thinks about life, all right? It's a degree of self-preservation and narcissism that means when this happened, when October 7th happened, I would presume inside his head that his first thought was, what am I going to do? I'm on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court. The trial's been running for 3 years. I cut this deal with these crazy ministers, Bezalel Smotrich, and Itamar Ben-Gvir. It's the most right-wing, fundamentalist, homophobic, Jewish supremacist government in the history of the state of Israel. I cut this deal and prevented any other. Israel has been through 5 elections in 4 years. The reason is Netanyahu must remain prime minister, because if he doesn't, the trial will conclude probably in another year. And there's a fair chance, since there's precedent, Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, was not indicted when he was prime minister. He had resigned, but he was indicted and convicted and served 16 months in jail. So it is self-preservation that is the way this man looks at the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel. So a normal human, Benny Gantz, any of Israeli, Ehud Barak, would have thought first and foremost, not about the M and me. They turned the M and me upside down, so it became a W in we. That's what a normal human would do. They think about the interests of the state. Now, that said, if you look at his behavior during this crisis and his efforts to blame, for which he had to apologize, the IDF and the intelligence, he has not yet accepted responsibility.
I guess
Everyone
that's
else
still-
has. So the answer is,
What should Israel have done, I guess, if,
I
as
don't-
opposed to what Netanyahu should have done? I guess that's really my question.
I don't think, and again, I pressed Israeli military analysts and others in our military as to whether or not there was a plan B. That's the real question. Did Israel have any other choice other than blockade of Gaza, punishing airstrikes, a ground campaign, which if the numbers are accurate, by this morning's count, over 10,000 Palestinians dead, 25,000 wounded. Did Israel have any other alternative? That's the question.
Right.
And given the events of October 7th, the only possible, and oh, by the way, let's add the hostages in there as well. Somebody said, what would we have done if 1,400 Americans, someone had raised the hypothetical of a Mexican cartel coming across the border, murdering 1,000 people. What would we have done? We have a proximity problem, kind of, but not really. What would we have done? Given everything I know, even factoring in Netanyahu's narcissism, I don't think any other Israeli prime minister could have or would have behaved any differently.
We'll give the last word.
Sorry, by the way,
Oh, no,
I
that's
was
right.
droning on, I didn't get the question, I apologize.
So we'll have 2 last words. Governor, you'll have the very last word.
Okay.
But we'll go to Ben Lingeman, who's with the State Department on the Iran desk.
Hi, Ben Lingeman, I'm the Public Affairs Officer for Iran in the State Department. And you mentioned this, but we have had a number of incoming attacks on U.S. positions, even reports yesterday of a rocket hitting near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, really shocking things. And the president has now hit back twice, including strikes last night. I'm just wondering if, crossing our fingers and these groups keep shooting rockets and they keep missing some big group of Americans. Where do you think this goes from here? What do you think the president should do? I'm, as a public affairs officer, I'm keenly aware of criticism in the nightly news and on the Hill, the fact that, we've been hit 57 times or however many times, and
You want a tougher response. The question is, would a disproportionate response, not against Iranian assets in Iran, but Iranian assets in the Gulf or elsewhere, with that kind of risk readiness on the part of the administration, change Tehran's calculation? Either would it get them to reduce, how many attacks have they been? You probably 30, 40?
50 or 50 something.
To reduce those attacks, or would it incentivize them to up the ante. If your final conclusion is that Iran does not, it's all a matter, it's the same thing with the administration's position on these informal understandings that Jake Sullivan indirectly reached with Iran on de-escalatory steps. All depends on your calculation of your risk assessment. If you believe that between now and the 2024 election, before this happens, there would be very little danger of a major Israeli-Iranian or U.S.-Iranian brouhaha, you'd probably, for political reasons, want to pull back. If you believe, however, that there's a credible chance of an incident morphing into a direct conflict, you'd want to de-escalate. And the same calculation, I think, has to be made here. Somebody has made an assessment that Iran does not want a major confrontation with the United States. If that is true, then the administration is put in the unenviable position of responding proportionately, hoping that these attacks don't find their mark, and weathering the political heat that they're getting, as they had for the $6 billion, which have now been frozen, I understand. Is that correct?
Not a penny has been spent.
Not a penny has been spent, right.
That's our talking
That's a
point
good way
today.
to put it. So, I mean, I think that's the calculation. And by our behavior, I believe that the administration has reason that they're prepared to respond proportionately on the assumption that Iran doesn't want this to escalate. Now, people make mistakes, they get lucky, and you get tripped into a major crisis.
So Governor, we'll give the last word to you.
Okay, well, thank you. You know, this thing isn't just a proximity problem, it's also a history problem. Because the Holocaust and the Nazi atrocities are built into the Jewish bones everywhere in Israel and everywhere in the United States. So I just want to know if I'm right about this. I mean, all of this is politics, all of it is. And the Hamas deliberately did this to goad the Jewish state to do exactly what they're doing. And the goal there is the destruction of the legitimacy of the Israeli state. To destroy that, which they were getting ready to get a certification from the Saudis before this attack. But the Americans love negotiations, just love them. And there's really no reason to negotiate if the positions are inalterable. And the Palestinians have said that they want a one-state solution, just theirs. They don't want a Jewish state solution that exists at all. And yet the Israeli state, their fundamental bottom line is to exist as a state so that they can have protection against another Holocaust. These things can't be reconciled. How are you going to negotiate anything like that? Have I misunderstood the situation here?
You said no. Well, yes and no. You've got, and the Palestinian national movement's a complicated enterprise. Right now, it looks like Noah's Ark. There are two of everything. Two statelets, two sets of security services, two constitutions, two visions of where Palestine is and what it's supposed to. You know, I participated over the years in any number of efforts with Israeli prime ministers and mostly Arafat to see if you could find a conflict-ending solution. We've not been able to do that. The 6 core issues that divide Israelis and Palestinians, not Hamas. Let's take Hamas out of this. They're not interested in a negotiation. They're largely interested over time in producing the very outcome that you suggest. One way or another, 100 years, look at the Crusaders. I mean, right, it's just, time is, I measure my life in administration time, in 4 and 8 year increments. That's not how the Middle East works. It's generational. And time is an ally for some and an adversary for some. You know, in response to it can never be anything else. You may be right. I occupy a tiny space on the planet for a very short period of time. I have two grown children. They're in their 40s. I cannot, in all good conscience, and never do, say to them, and this concerns, by the way, the thing that I'm really concerned about, which is the fate of the American Republic. I can't say to them, and never, I can't mortgage their future by saying it'll never happen. It's impossible. I don't have that right morally or ethically, because unlike Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, reading the best of golden trails, I cannot divine what's in front of me. I don't know the answer. And I think it's morally unconscionable, at least for me and my kids, to basically say to them, it can never be. It just can't be. Elie Wiesel, talked about that without hope, there's no life. And that guy's experience, if anybody, should have been willing and able to give up on the world. It should have been Elie Wiesel, given his experiences in Buchenwald. The fact that he survived and that there's a pathway forward, and we have to be careful that we don't see the world the way we want it to be. It has to be reconciled with the way the world is. So here's my bottom line. Jack Kennedy was the first and last president who ever had an emotional impact on me. I was 12 when he was murdered. Kennedy described himself, and I borrowed it. This is where I am, as an idealist without illusion. Idealism without illusion. Never give up on the prospects that you, your family, your city, your neighborhood, your country can somehow look for something better. But as you go through that process of change, you've got to go through it with your eyes wide open. It's reconciling the way the world is with the way you want it to be in the middle, whether it's marriage, business, diplomacy, it is in the middle, usually where the answers are to be found. And I'm just open to that. But you elegantly describe the dark vision that hangs over Israelis and Palestinians. I think, sadly, they understand one another only too well. That's part of the problem, part of the challenge that we face.
Very eloquent, thank you.
So on that note,
This was very